Good evening, everyone. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am professor of history at Howard University. We are here today for one more session of the Slavery Archive Book Club. And I would like to introduce my co-hosts. We will start with Alex Hill from Columbia University and Vanessa Holden from University of Kentucky, Jessica Johnson, she is also with us, Jessica from Johns Hopkins, and we are four people then hosting this book club already for 1 year now, and we are very happy to be here today because we'll be discussing today this great book by Brandi Brimmer, who is an associate professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And the title of the book, as you can see, is Claiming Union, Widowhood, Race, Respectability, and Poverty in the Post-Emancipation South, a book that was published then in 2020 with Duke University Press. And let me introduce you briefly Brandi Brimmer. She is an associate professor and a Kane Scholar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research recovers then poor and working class Black women's social justice vision and battles for citizenship during the 19th century. She's the author of the book that I just showed to you, Claiming Union, Widowhood, Race, Respectability, and Poverty in the Post-Emancipation South with Duke University Press, 2020. And also she's the author of scholarly articles that have appeared in the Journal of Southern History and the Journal of the Civil War Era. Brimmer's research has been supported by the National Humanities Center, the African American History, Culture, and Digital Humanities Project at the University of Maryland, College Park, the Benjamin Pauls Humanities Institute at Morgan State University, the College of Liberal Arts at Case Western University, the Ford Foundation, and the North Carolina Society. Prior to joining the faculty at UNC Chapel Hill, she was a residential fellow at the National Humanities Center, and she also taught in the Department of History at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Then welcome, Brandi, and we are looking forward to discuss the book and to encourage our attendants to read and to ask you questions and participate and celebrate your book. Thank you for accepting presenting the book here.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Before we came online today, I want to say what I said to you privately, which is I just want to thank all of the organizers for the time and labor you all have put into creating this online community, for amplifying various voices, and quite frankly, including me in what has been, in my opinion, one of the most vibrant spaces for the study of slavery and emancipation online. So I thank you for that, and I'm deeply honored to be here. I thought I would start today by just introducing myself again, giving a little more context to who I am as a historian, and then talking about some basic and key arguments in the book, and some of the broader implications of the book, or at least I think come out of the book. And so I am a historian of slavery and emancipation in the United States, and I study the lives of enslaved people through an intersectional lens. The aspect of American slavery that I research revolves around wartime emancipation and the consequences of Black freedom in the American South. I have spent well over a decade engaged in archival research aimed at recovering the voices of Black people, both free and enslaved, from what I call the American Civil War Archive. And I write and have clearly been influenced by the works of W.E.B. Du Bois and more recent scholars like Thomas Holt, Thafolia Glimpse, Tara Hunter, among others, who acknowledge enslaved women's political acumen and participation in the destruction of slavery. Insights from the fields of gender and emancipation and my own archival explorations have led to a series of projects aimed at recovering sort of how working poor women are engaging the state, and connected to that, their legal consciousness in post-emancipation Black communities across the South. So in claiming union widowhood, I analyze the formal and informal methods Black women use to engage the US pension system over the meaning and definition of union widowhood. I draw on a rich array of, the rich history rather, of enslaved women in the United States and African-American political history to enlarge the realm of Black women's engagement with governmental institutions during the Civil War and Reconstruction era. This project is based on an analysis of nearly 1,500 pension files initiated by Southern Black women. I show how newly freed Black women leverage their status as union widowhoods to gain access to the US pension bureaucracy. And I argue that ordinary Black women proved to be savvy legal actors who recognize the pension system as an important arena of activism and redress. So in writing this account of Black war widows, I made use of a vast array of archival sources to recreate the everyday lives of enslaved women transitioning to freedom in Eastern North Carolina. I started by identifying their names in the Civil War Pension Index and securing their pension files at the National Archives in Washington, DC. I analyzed census records, the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, local newspapers, property records, wills, and maps, to understand how enslaved women took aim at the institution of slavery through their day-to-day existence and sustained themselves and their families in refugee camps across the state. I traced their stories to the battlefield of Olustee, Florida, and Honey Hill, South Carolina, where those who worked as nurses treated the diseased and injured. Others cooked, washed, and laundered for Union generals, their intimate partners and husbands. Until very recently, the story of Black Union widows' battle for pension has been largely overlooked. And this oversight is surprising, considering that there are, according to one scholar's count, an estimated 35 to 40,000 named on the pension cards of Black soldiers in the Civil War Pension Index. These individuals qualified for these benefits or filed petitions on the basis of their loved one's service, based on their husband's wartime military service and their ability to establish their marital relation to the deceased soldiers to the satisfaction of the Bureau. And I'll talk more about these questions of marriage, definition of marriage, and what's at stake in what I see as a contested debate. So Civil War widows could file petitions for benefits under two basic systems, the general law and service law pension system. The Act of July 14th, 1862 sets up the general law system, and it provided for the widows and children of soldiers killed in battle through a legal structure that required proof of legal marriage and evidence of war-related death or disease. Since the marriages of enslaved people were not authorized or effectuated through legal routes, Black soldiers' widows were initially excluded from the system. The 1864 Confederate massacre of Black soldiers in the Battle of Fort Pillow amplified this injustice. Pressure from war widows, both Black and white, led President Lincoln to call for the equal treatment of Black families freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in the pension system. And so federal lawmakers respond to this and honor the sacrifice in the context of Fort Pillow, of dead Black soldiers and their families by creating the Supplementary Pension Act of 1864. And that's what we want to pay attention to, because that is the sort of legal route that women are making their claims on the basis of within this context. What they also do is to accept eyewitness testimony, or in other words, to relax the evidentiary standards so that eyewitness testimony would be accepted to affirm marital unions of persons freed, again, by the Emancipation Proclamation in lieu of a marriage certificate. This This act then recognizes what the institution of slavery denied, the right of enslaved people to marry and have a family. My analysis of Black women's struggles for pensions is told from the vantage point of Black refugee women who emerged from the Trent River settlement camp situated near New Bern, North Carolina. And I do think here, I'm just going to shift over to my screen. Here we go. Okay, and okay, I'm just going to move in a bit to get some visual context for New Bern. And so this is just sort of a snapshot of New Bern in 1860. And so what you're looking at is basically just the demographics. Let me turn back, I'm sorry. And basically you're looking at a total population of close to 5,500 people with a total population of Black, and here I'm including both enslaved and free Blacks, close to 3,100 people. And New Bern would become the home to one of, as I said earlier, one of the largest refugee settlement camps in the state. And so you're talking about, as of January 1865, you have some 10,000, close to 11,000 refugees living in and around New Bern. Unofficial counts of the population of New Bern in May of 1865 reports a population somewhere between 15 to 20,000 Blacks living inside the boundaries of, in and around the municipal boundaries of the city. So this is a pretty important place for Black refugees fleeing under the Emancipation Proclamation. But it's also a port city that was home to a vibrant pre-war community of Black artisans. And it's a place where New Bern's Black population expanded and complicated notions of freedom's boundaries during the war. So again, you can see there is a constant flow of newcomers with an earnest desire to enact freedom on terms that made sense to them. And these are the people that would enrich New Bern's wartime landscape. Although these women and the women who populated or part of this population wielded far less power than pension professionals and military administrators who represented their cases, I show throughout the course of the book how these women cultivated knowledge about the system and interacted with pension professionals in their neighborhoods. And so I'm happy to talk more about sort of my methodological approach or this question of why New Bern, and I hope that also comes out as I continue. The petitions that are initiated by newly free Black women reveal a complex series of relationships and negotiations buttressed by newly free Black women's savvy understanding of the Pension Bureau and its law. They presented a very different sense of union widowhood to the Pension Bureau, one that included an analysis of their enslavement and slavery's afterlife in free labor society. Importantly, they called attention to their unpaid labor, child raising work, sexual violation, disease and disabilities in their claims. They also clarified the significance of marriage and family in their transition from slavery to freedom. When freed women confronted Bureau examiners with graphic testimonies about their lives under slavery, they attempted to unravel notions about, or at least I argue, unravel notions about Black women's racial inferiority bound up and deeply ingrained in the Bureau's construction of union widowhood. So I now want to elaborate on how my analysis of the pension application process at the grassroots level and from the perspective of for Black women, what's different about it? You know, what intervention is it making into the fields of African-American Southern women's and gender history? And so to do so, I want to talk about the case file of Charlotte Banks, a person who I talk a great deal about in this book, who I met very early on in my research at the National Archives, and continues to fascinate me when I think about this long-term battle. But from a researcher's perspective, Charlotte Banks' case is really interesting because it starts as early as 1869 and it goes to about 1911 when I suspect Charlotte Banks transitioned. She was a formerly enslaved woman who waged a decades-long battle, albeit unsuccessful, to secure benefits based on her slave marriage. And so again, I selected this case to show how one woman who was a part of this refugee community mobilized the grassroots, what I call the grassroots pension network, presented her married life to the Bureau, and the politics that emerged from her encounters with the federal government and Bureau officials in New Bern, North Carolina. And I'll come back to this map. I'm just going to shift. This gives you a sort of a snapshot of the applicants that I'm looking at. So again, I talked to you about the 1,500 claims that I looked at for this book. And one of the great things about doing this work that I know many of our audience members know that case files are not humans. Humans do a lot of things. They migrate, they move, they come back and forth. And that's precisely what happens in New Bern. It's a very transient place. And the petitioners themselves taught me a lot about geography and how they thought about geography, what it meant to be in Eastern North Carolina. And while they certainly would talk about New Bern, their sense of place, movement between counties is very different than the way in which one might begin to approach a study. And so essentially what I mean by that is folks who lived in New Bern would have no problem going to Hyde County, going to Eatonton, going to New Hanover, coming back to New Bern, but then moving as far north as New York or Philadelphia and returning to New Bern within the context but also rebuilding community within these movements. And so it's quite fascinating. The other thing I just want to say as I delve into Charlotte's case study is that again, she is a part of one of 1,500 case files that I looked at. But I narrowed it down to these 244 Black Union widows, dependent mothers, et cetera, because these are the people that I saw a lot in New Bern. I mean, they moved around, but I was really able to sort of reconstruct what you see in the book from these case files, okay? And so again, I'm happy to talk more about that research process and that body of files. Born near Elizabeth City, North Carolina, sometime around 1830, Charlotte experienced enslavement as the majority of enslaved people in the state of North Carolina on a small farm. Here, social ties and cross-farm marriages laid the basis for neighborhoods, as spouses usually lived within a few miles of each other. Her first husband, whom she shared a daughter, quote, died before the war. Charlotte dared to marry again, this time around 1854, to Caesar Banks, who lived on a neighboring farm. Caesar's owner sold him away shortly thereafter. Charlotte's struggle for wartime freedom unfolded in the Trent River settlement camp just outside of New Bern. With an estimated population of close to 11,000 Black refugees at war's end, New Bern was the largest wartime camp, one of the largest wartime camps for Black refugees in the state. Upon her arrival to the camp in 1863, she learned that Caesar had enlisted in the 35th Regiment of the United States Colored Troop. The death of Caesar Banks in a South Carolina military hospital in May of 1864 literally transformed Charlotte into a war widow in theory, but not the law. As noted earlier, not until July of 1864 did federal lawmakers open up the system that would recognize the sacrifice of dead Black soldiers who were once enslaved. Lawmakers did so by retroactively recognizing the marriages of enslaved men and women. By recognizing the marriages of formerly enslaved women, individuals like Charlotte Banks could secure benefits under the general law system based on their husband's military service. Now, scholars such as David Schaffer, Linda Faye Williams convincingly show how racism and evidentiary obstacles made it difficult for Black women to secure their benefits. I certainly found similar patterns in my study of war widows in Eastern North Carolina. I want to just pause and give full citation and credit to Donald Schaefer's amazing work. But essentially what you're looking at is a random sample that he did of white and Black soldiers. He found that, and this perhaps for the audience won't be surprising, but the percent of white widows pensioned was roughly 20% more than Black soldiers' widows. So I'm looking at the third row down. And what I found in North Carolina, as I said, was very similar. These women faced extraordinary challenges to even find someone to represent their claim. There were just a number of challenges in terms of securing medical evidence. So even though the system is opened up to create a pathway to allow for Black women, but particularly enslaved women, to make claims on the government through the pension system, it was extraordinarily difficult. And because my work really sort of aligned with that, I said, well, wait a minute, what's going on? I started to think about these numbers, and I wanted to know what was behind the numbers and what was the story that I was going to tell here. And part of that story, and I always like to start with the slide because I started to notice patterns in the pension files that I was looking at again, that the numbers just didn't hold up. And so even though we're looking at percent pension of individuals' pension, the reality for Black women in particular, so I'm not saying that this doesn't happen for white women, that white women aren't taking off the rolls. Yes, they certainly are. But I noticed that Black women, because of their inability to show documentary evidence to establish their marriages, were regularly examined and investigated through the special examination process. And my work then goes further than the previous mentioned authors by focusing on racialized constructions of womanhood operating at the center of the pension system. Charlotte's case is really representative of that point, right? So this is her husband's pension file. We can see that she filed in 1869. But this is just a brief timeline of the kind of activity that just before 1873 that you can see in her file, that she petitions for benefits in 69, that she's admitted in roughly 1872. My date is up there. There's an investigation in 1873. And she's on the pension rolls roughly 12 months before she's investigated again, and she's taking off the pension rolls. That's the kind of movement that in mobility that I wanted to, and up and downness that I wanted to capture in my study, that I think goes beyond the numbers. So again, after in Charlotte's claim, Charlotte pension officials grant Charlotte pension in April of 1872. She began collecting roughly $8 a month on a quarterly basis. And roughly a year after that, she's taken off the pension roster. And she's taken off on the basis of a report that a large number of Black union widows, including Charlotte Banks, had violated the Bureau's remarriage law. So essentially what this Bureau examiner comes down and notices that that there are a number of Black women who are claiming benefits who are now complying with the 1866 North Carolina marriage law, which is embedded in the Black codes. And in doing that, they now have violated the pension rule. And that is that once you claim a pension, that is to basically take the place of a deceased spouse. Once you remarry, you are to report to the Bureau. And if you don't, you are in violation of that rule. I talked about some of these things. Okay, so one, I just wanted to show that volatility. And I also just want to make the point here that, again, where I am going beyond the numbers, as I mentioned earlier, is that my interpretation of Black unions, these claims, grapples with really sort of foundational insights theorized by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and I would argue advanced by Hannah Rosen, concerning the ways that race produces meaning and simultaneously masks a range of different power relations. So part of the point, I just want to back up here and make the point that women's access to, enslaved women's access to the Bureau hinges on on marriage. That really defines their rights within the Bureau. They are bringing different perspectives about marriage to the Bureau that are informed by their enslavement. And they're bringing it to a system that is purportedly colorblind. And so essentially what I'm saying here in the argument I'm advancing here is that gender and ideas about marriage is beginning to do the work of setting up new racial systems in the Bureau. That's doing the race of setting up racial difference within the system, because enslaved women don't have the same kind of documentation. Their definitions of marriage are very different, and that begins to differentiate them within the system. So studies of Black soldiers, widows, and wives generally fall along two lines. Those that use pension case files to highlight and reconstruct the social lives of freed people and their marriages, and those that situate the struggle for pension within the momentous social and political changes brought by the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the subsequent Reconstruction amendments. I am certainly building on those analyses in my own work, but I move in a new direction by focusing on the process by which newly freed Black women like Charlotte Banks initiated their petitions. Elsa Barkley Brown's rigorous analysis of the Black public sphere in Richmond, Virginia, really led me to reconceptualize the pension application process in New Bern from the perspective of the Black poor. Coupled with feminist approaches to social welfare studies, I framed the Bureau as a site of contestation and debate, where newly freed Black women took a leading role in challenging the Bureau's definition of marriage and sexual respectability to measure the legitimacy of their claims. It is in these battles and exchanges with local examiners that I locate Black women's politics. The key to understanding the pension file of Charlotte Banks then lay in the definition of marriage she presented to the Bureau, the intricate social networks and neighborhood ties that she and other Black refugees forged in the chaos of war, and the grassroots pension network. This aspect of Black women's struggle for pensions has not been fully acknowledged in the scholarship. And so framing Charlotte's story in this way does not necessarily change the outcome of her case, but it does expand the realm of political issues that free people debated during the Civil War and Reconstruction era, and cast poor Black women as significant political actors. The application process required petitioners to reduce their recollections of enslavement, forced separation, and displacement to a series of short affidavits and personal statements. At their best, pension files are rich in detail. At their worst, they are sketchy and incomplete. Charlotte's case file really falls into both categories because it includes scraps of robust commentary from the period between 1869 and 1873, and then it really kind of goes silent. And then after 1890, it picks up again with a wealth of testimony from her peers. In the post-war years, Black veterans and their families of dead Black soldiers who lived in and around New Bern established themselves as central participants in what I call the pension network. And I see Charlotte as a part of this network. And I think this network explains why her pension file is so even and why we have so much activity after 1890. Yes, it's because the Bureau's laws are changing. Yes, it's because we have a creation of a special examination division, but it is also because of her participation in Black institutions that we have grown familiar with in the historiography of Reconstruction that lay the basis for what I'm calling the pension network. The pension network was facilitated by ordinary Black people, Black middle-class leaders, and white military administrators. In the pension files, Black neighborhoods such as New Bern's Fifth Ward, which you can see is sort of outlined in this map, and James City, formerly again, the Trent River settlement camp for refugees, emerged as distinct sites of political collaboration in the testimonies of Black women seeking remuneration based on their husband's military service and their own resistance. I found that much of Black people's communication about benefits for Union soldiers' families took place outside of the purview of the Pension Bureau and within Black community institutions. They often exchanged information about the application process at Black-owned businesses, religious institutions, at public gatherings, again, church meetings. Here in these spaces, they learned about the federal pension system and the claims process. It's significant then to understand that Charlotte Banks attended the St. John's Baptist Church for roughly 32 years. Here she socialized with war widows such as Amy Squires, Mary Lee, Anna Jones, and disabled Black veterans such as Luke Martin. Members of the Second Street Baptist Church or the St. John's Baptist Church may have learned about their pension eligibility during one of Reverend John S. Johnson's meetings to organize New Bern's cooks and domestics. Though invisible in her initial claim, Charlotte drew on the resources from her neighborhood and neighborhood institutions before she hired attorney Edward Carpenter, a white wartime correspondent, to represent her claim. Now, the first generation of attorneys to represent the claims of both veterans and widows in New Bern, these agents that are doing this business are largely white military administrators and local attorneys. Carpenter and his brother Seth dominated the pension business in Eastern North Carolina, but he ultimately lost his license. And he did so because there were a lot of complaints from Black war widows who felt that Carpenter was not turning over their money and was doing a disservice and basically cheating them out of their pension dollars. Even after he is suspended from being an attorney, Carpenter advanced to a position in Craven County Superior Courts as a probate judge as a new generation of Black agents emerge in New Bern. In addition to the sort of claim agents that populate the pension network, you also have the regular presence of special examiners who are agents of the Pension Bureau who conduct very localized examinations on a regular basis. And because of the high number of disabled soldiers as well as Black widows who are residents of New Bern, these special examiners become familiar faces. Black community members know exactly who they are. They, even if they are not eligible for benefits, they likely will come forward to offer witness testimony. And so they become very familiar and well versed in pension laws, but also their ability to identify pension examiners who are going in and out of their neighborhoods. Writing to the Commissioner of Pensions in April of 1873, one examiner observed quote, more than one half of the widows and mothers who are pensioners in Craven County are remarried under North Carolina's Marriage Act of 1866. He made this determination after scrutinizing Craven County's marriage register. Evidence from the pension file suggests that Black women interpreted North Carolina's marriage mandate of 1866 in ways that made sense to them. Many of them secured their license required by the state, but also continued to live their lives on their own terms. In fact, Charlotte had remarried under the marriage law of 1866. She married a man named David Holloway in compliance, to be in compliance with the law. What that means is that when she petitioned for benefits in 1869, she had already gone before New Bern's Justice of the Peace to register her marriage. Technically, then, her case fits squarely within the Bureau's understanding of fraud. And for some, marriage fraud resulted in criminal prosecution. But that's not what happened in Charlotte's case. Instead, a local pension examiner escorted Charlotte to New Bern's branch of the Freedmen's Bank, where she had established an account and deposited her money. He demanded that she hand over all the funds issued by the government, which amounted to a little over $200. Charlotte complied. She told him, quote, "If I had done anything wrong, I was willing to make it right as far as it was in my power." This face-to-face interaction is how poor Black women engaged the Pension Bureau over federal resources in their communities and often very publicly. Reading Charlotte's case file alongside the case files of nearly 250 Black female petitioners who lived in and around New Bern enabled me to reconstruct what I think are some key features of her case. Again, the conception of marriage Charlotte repeatedly put forward in her petitions was bold and capacious and accounted for her life under slavery. Marital practices depended on cultural norms of gender, sexuality, and family. Consequently, Charlotte emphasized the need to understand how such relationships operated in her Elizabeth City neighborhood. From her perspective, the Bureau's recognition of slave marriage was not a definitive statement. Rather, it was subject to revision precisely because the definition and meaning of marriage underwent significant change as enslaved women and people transitioned to free labor society. Charlotte's case gained new life, as I said earlier, after 1890. And it did so when she hired a Black claims agent by the name of Frederick Douglass. Now, I just need to pause here, not the abolitionist leader. This is a person, an enslaved man who was born in Jones County. In fact, here I have his Freedmen's Bureau bank record, as well as what is the only note stationary from Frederick Douglass. But Frederick Douglass emerges after E.W. Carpenter as the principal claim agent, not only in New Bern, but represents cases across the state of North Carolina. And it's with his help that she filed a series of new petitions seeking reconsideration of her case. The witnesses who came forward in these petitions also emerged from the Trent River settlement, including Matilda Wells, a young woman from Elizabeth City, who took an active part in the application process. She provided eyewitness testimony and showed up for Charlotte when called upon by pension professionals and bureau examiners. Matilda, who married a Black veteran at the war's end, may in fact have learned to navigate the bureau through her relationship with Charlotte and her connection to Frederick Douglass. In the pension records, the type of community support displayed by Charlotte's witnesses reflects the ethos of mutuality conceptualized by Thomas Holt. According to Holt, this ethos governed working class Black communities across the South. Charlotte and her witnesses made a determined effort to adapt her definition of marriage and widowhood to meet the government standards. Her struggle to support herself on the wages she earned as a domestic and her involvement in neighborhood religious institutions, moreover, cemented her reputation as a respectable woman and a worthy widow in her community. In the end, none of this mattered, as Charlotte would never regain her standing on the pension roster. I chose to elaborate on Charlotte's case today because it underscores the necessity for deep contextual analysis of enslaved women's lives under slavery alongside the Pension Bureau to understand what's happening in this post-emancipation moment, I would argue at least. Framing Black women's struggles for pensions or positioning them in a continuum of grassroots political struggle expands scholarly understandings of enslaved and freed women's political struggles. Though excluded from the electoral arena, Black women established a new relationship to the federal government by leveraging their standing as union widows. This was especially true for freed women like Charlotte Banks, whose appearance in the Civil War archive might have been reduced to marriage fraud had it not been for her own sense of worthiness and savvy understanding of the Pension Bureau and its laws. And I think I'll end there. And I'll stop my share.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandi. And now, do we have questions? Then if you want to ask a question, the only thing that you need to do is to go to reactions at the bottom of your screen, click on it and raise your hand. There are some conversation going on now in the chat, but I would like those who are in the chat perhaps ask your questions out loud, or we are going to read for you.
I think this one we can just relay. Just a quick question: were white widows taken off the rolls when they remarried?
Why were they taken off the rolls when they?
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah. Yes. No. Thank you. That's a great point of clarification. So that's what's happening in Charlotte's case. When widows remarry, they are under the guidelines of the Bureau supposed to report to the Bureau and basically come off the rolls. What happens is that a number of women, both Black and white, don't necessarily do that. And part of the context that I'm trying to provide is that it's not just that they're not arbitrarily doing that, particularly when we're talking about enslaved women. We're talking about enslaved women transitioning to free labor society in search of wages and experiencing extreme poverty. So there's real reasons why one might make that decision. But they're also making that decision because for some, I think they are, and it's important to make this point, that, and even with the example that I gave, it feels a lot like the 20th century welfare rights or welfare sort of investigations. But it's important to note that these benefits are entitlement benefits. They are quickly, however, racialized, I would argue, And I think it's important to think about how and why that happens. These benefits aren't necessarily aid, but initially Black women very early on are targeted and positioned in ways where their benefits are distributed, and the conversation sounds like they're getting like aid instead of entitlement benefits that they earned on the basis of their husband's service. When I see cases of fraud, that's when I really start doing the investigation, because I always think something's going on there. It might be an issue of poverty, but it also might be an issue that someone thinks that, you know, that they should still be able to have this lifetime benefit of support. So the short answer is yes, remarried women are to basically self-report and come off of the pension roster. And if they don't do that and examiners find them continuing to collect benefits and remarrying, or later by 1882, if they are rumored to be in an intimate sexual partnership with a man, they are targeted, investigated, and ultimately can be taken off the rolls. So.
Thank you. And now, do we have questions? I see in the chat, Lori and Dawn. Let me ask you if you would like to ask your questions on video.
Lori, that was Lori's question, the one that I relayed.
Okay, the one that is
so.
okay, and then there is Dawn now. Do you want to ask your question? Yes,
sure.
Here she is.
Hi, thank you so much. I just moved to Maryland, and I'm just like researching the complicated history here, being they have legalized slavery, part of the Union. I'm just wondering if you have any other resources besides the pension index and the census, because I'm trying to get the school where I'm working at to delve into this history a little bit more.
So are you asking for just sort of recommendations about sources and how to study these sorts of questions within a border state? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I would say, I mean, and this is tough, and I faced this as well, and I've created a lot of debt for myself in this way. I mean, one thing is, if you're working in Maryland, one thing you have on your side is that you're very close to the National Archives, and you can get, if your home institution doesn't have Ancestry, Fold 3, and things like that, you can get to the National Archives. But unfortunately, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So you have to sort of think about if you want to make that investment in newspapers.com, Ancestry, online, as well as Fold 3. There's actually quite a bit of information on Fold 3 that you can access in that way. And a lot of the Freedmen's Bureau records are available. You can access them through Ancestry. But again, that now becomes an issue of raises, in some cases, ethical issues about what do Black lives look like in digital spaces? Are they being commodified again in these spaces? And just sort of a range of issues about how you sort of interact with primary documents online. So I would say that. But I would also say that UNC Chapel Hill has a pretty robust digital archive with a lot of sources related to enslavement. But in Maryland, I would be looking at the Baltimore State Archives, the Maryland State Archives, or the Baltimore City Archives, as well as the Maryland State Archives. I think would be a rich resource. And then lastly, I would say the Freedmen and Southern Society project has published numerous volumes that are particularly volumes that are dedicated to families, Black soldiers' families, that I think you would get a lot out of. Yeah.
Thank you. And now we have 3 questions. I think that the first one is Vanessa Holden.
Yeah, so I have a question about the way that children enter your study. I noticed that you talked about indenture in North Carolina. I'm more familiar with the Virginia case, and of course it was prevalent there too. So my first question is, do you know what happened to these indenture contracts when the war ends? Does that change anything for indentured children? And then my second question has to do really with, how children appear and how they do or don't enter these suits for pensions.
Let me take the second question first. So again, we come back to questions of marriage and heterosexual marriage and sort of notions of nuclear family that have really big implications for enslaved people who aren't necessarily sort of organizing their lives in that way. They are also bringing a legacy of slavery that there just was a far more complicated system of family and intimacy and intimate relationships. And so what that means is that women, and there is a section in the book where I talk about the very specific rules that are set up to evaluate and investigate Black mothers, but also to determine in an age before DNA testing, examiners were literally directed to line their children up and compare their skin complexions to make a determination of whether or not these are the children of the soldier. And because this is printed in the guidelines for the special examiners, because enslaved women, formerly enslaved women, are rumored to have or have a habit, it says in the book, of trying to make claims to expand their pension for minors by adopting a lot of children. But the reality is this, Norley Frankel's book is a great example of this. I don't have as much of this in my study in Eastern North Carolina. I mean, I certainly have examples of contesting widows. So more than one widow woman making a claim on the basis of a soldier and then making claims for their children as well. An examiner or the bureau is interested in who has the more legitimate claim, and were these children the children of the soldier? And if that is proven to be true, one woman will be knocked out, be recognized, and the children potentially could be recognized. What you also have happened in refugee camps, which were, horrible, squalid living conditions, with disease and rampant disease, et cetera. So I have a lot of cases where children are orphaned during the war, and you have children establishing their relationship to their fathers. In order to do that, they have to establish that their mothers were married to their fathers. So even children have the bar of establishing marriage and establishing their legitimacy. What I also think is interesting about your question is it is in these case files with children where we start to get the language about legitimate and illegitimate children. I don't really use that language in my own life because all children are legitimate. But I just think it's really interesting how that kind of language travels to the 20th century. Your first question was about indentures and what happens to those indentures. And I just want to make sure I understand because certainly after, this is the work of Rebecca Scott, right, who talks about in North Carolina in particular, how Black children are treated very differently. And so you have this really, a really big sort of legal suit in the state of North Carolina where all apprenticeship cases that get set up in this early period during Reconstruction have to be abandoned because they were illegal, because Black children were being held and indentured much longer. So that unfolds in the Reconstruction era. And even after that happens, I mean, you still have in apprenticeships, children being apprenticed if single mothers, and if single mothers can establish that they are able to support their children. But I think your question is interesting because although I'm talking about widows as they're defined in the pension system on the ground, women who lose their husbands are still very vulnerable. If they have a lot of children, that is another reason why they're pursuing pensions, to be able to provide for their children, because they could potentially be apprenticed. And that actually happens in one of the cases that I write about in the early chapters of the book. Yeah. So
yeah,
does that is that getting at what you're asking?
I think I'm more interested in folks who were forced, because of the way the law worked in Carolina, to indenture their free children before emancipation. Does this law change post-emancipation, now that there's no slavery? And then what happens to these children who were, bound out by ministers of the poor or by parents before the war?
Well, so in the first chapter of the book, yes, the free Black children are vulnerable to apprenticeship if their parents can't show that they can support their children, financially support their children, and that parents are not working, and that children have to be working in a particular apprenticeship or trade, but that apprenticeship is also oftentimes back-breaking work. One of the examples that I give in the book is that of Louisa Powers. And I like her case a lot because she's an example of someone who does what I would call, and Karen Zip has some more specific language around it, but sort of a community, sort of apprentice. I mean, she navigates and sets up an apprenticeship contract with some of her neighbors so as to avoid the law. But the answer to your question is that yes, those apprenticeship cases, free Blacks, newly emancipated Blacks are still very susceptible to apprenticeship laws. And I mean, when you're talking about the Black codes, you're just talking about erasing some language about free Blacks that now all Blacks are having to sort of follow by those dictates. And so it means that they're very susceptible to forced apprenticeship during that period. I mean, you have cases where owners are literally going back and stealing children for labor because they're in search of labor. Yeah. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have now Roseanne Adderley, and let me just focus on her.
That's a little exciting. Brandi, it's good to see you. Congratulations on the book. I'm lucky enough to have met you a number of years ago. And I have lots of questions. I'm a bad person though, because I haven't done my fine read of the book, even though I've had it for a minute.
That's okay.
That has something to do with something you said earlier, but also the way you conclude the book about the role of the state and sort of what the state is after, what the state wants from Black women from their families, and also what these women's lives. And I wondered, after spending as much time as you did with these files, sort of what your assessment of what the state is really up to is. And I'll tell you what I'm really interested in. I wonder whether all of this chasing after fraud has zero to do with fraud, that it is entirely about the fitness of women generally, and Black women in particular, or is actual concern with fraud a part of the story? Resources are scarce, we don't like the system, the country is a mess, or is it an artifact of the records? Or is this just the path to police people's lives? Because there are times when, I know the 20th century that I've lived through more than I know any of this stuff. So that there are times when resources are scarce and they're like, and governments are actually cost cutting. They're penalizing the poor, but they're like, man, we got to find a way to save some money, not an airplane, but your life. And I wondered if you could say something about, like, is this an artifact of the records, that you get rich records when they're chasing after alleged fraud? Or is the fraud really just kind of a coat that's put around a kind of monitoring of a past to tell newly freed people how to run their lives?
I think it's a combination of the two. I think that, there's really clear and explicit conversations in national newspapers, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, about, almost sort of like these exposés of special examiners moving into communities Certainly not, this is not a Southern phenomenon. It happens in Detroit. It happens in New York. Again, it is not only African-American women, but I do think that the conversation is very rich among not just Black women, but formerly enslaved women, because their marriage, decisions around marriage and the organization of their households and how they use their resources, even after they're on the pension roster, begins to conflict with larger ideas about respectability and worthy widowhood. And sometimes the ways in which they're organizing their lives conflict with community notions of worthy widowhood. And you have community members that are beginning to write unsolicited letters to the Commissioner of Pensions to come check up on so-and-so because they're not using their resources correctly, or this other woman has this younger boyfriend and she's buying him clothes all the time and you took this person off the rolls. I mean, you literally have that level of reporting, sometimes from the very people that these women live in their communities with. I think there's a lot of tensions going on in the records, sort of class tensions that are going on in the records that explain that phenomenon. But I also think that it also has to do with rising expenditures. I mean, this is a system that is becoming increasingly costly. And lawmakers, federal lawmakers and pension officials are constantly being brought before the Secretary of Interior to report on the rising cost of the Bureau. And, so who's on that? And oftentimes soldiers are also evaluated again to make sure that that in fact they are ill, that in fact, are they able to work, and all these sort of designations about they're 1/4 of a laborer, 1/2 of a laborer, to kind of make these designations about how much individuals should be paid. But there is a surveillance arm of the Bureau too. And what I'm particularly struck by is the amount of money that is spent to surveil. That the amount of money that is spent to surveil these various communities and populations would have certainly seemed to have funded the pension system, rather than sort of pointing out who's doing what in whose bedroom. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have more.
Thank you. Go ahead. If you have another one, go ahead.
I guess my follow was to me how the women themselves perceived it, because you emphasized very much that this was an entitlement and that their approach to the state's role here was both stay out of my business, but also it's not just that I have needs, but and I
Exactly.
likewise had, if that's their construction of it, this isn't a case of the government providing a service. It is essentially providing a wage, something that is due.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I came to as I was sort of finishing the book and just reflecting on everything and really realizing that the story here is about why is it that women who are qualified for entitlement benefits from the very outset are being constructed as dependents. And that's really what I think the legacy of this story is, and the conversation that it's having with social welfare scholars of the welfare state. That some of these ideas about the welfare state are being perfected in the pension system. And so the real conversation is for the historian, sort of the intellectual work is to figure, well, how does that happen? When does that happen? And I really do think that Leslie Schramm and Nora Lee Frankel, I want to credit them, because I do think that they begin to start the conversation. I think where my work is different is that I'm doing this really sort of focused, fine-grained analysis of what's happening in individual women's lives. And finally, I would say, I do think that's what's happening in part with Charlotte Banks's case. And I think that's why she continues that conversation, because it is about the loss of her husband, the sacrifice of her family, and the individual sacrifices that women make. Many of the women that I write about weren't necessarily in the Trent River settlement. They were traveling with their husbands. They were literally on the battlefield with their husbands, and aren't recognized as nurses or laborers. And so they use the pension system then to amplify and publicize the work that they did during the wartime. And they do it through one of the only vehicles they have, which is through the widow's pension system. And probably one of the best examples we have of that is Harriet Tubman. All right. She ends up getting a pension on the basis of her marriage to, I believe it's Nelson Davis, but in fact, she serves as a nurse and is in pension on the basis of that work that she does. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandi. And now we have Jessica. I don't know if you want to go on video or if you just want to use audio to ask your question.
I'll just use audio and can everybody hear me?
Yes,
we can.
perfect.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi. Hopefully this is not, can't hear my kids too much because they're wilding right now. But Brandi, thank you for this magnificent book. I have two questions, I think. One question is about, I'm trying to think about how to phrase it. One question is about this question of womanhood and how you take up in the book and how you took up in your presentation, the way that the sort of makings of womanhood are actually be up for debate and being shaped. So not just up for debate, because we know that Black women are always part of the debate and conversation. And that's what, you know, so many of us have staked our work on, that Black women are intellectual producers and intellectual workers, and they themselves are also thinking about what's happening around them at the same time. But you take it a critical step further that I kind of want to acknowledge, which is that they're not just sort of, not that there's a just there, they're not just producing intellectual thought amongst themselves, are actually shaping how womanhood itself is being conceived, particularly in this post-emancipation movement. And I was wondering if you could talk just more about that, because I realized as I was listening to you and that the stakes of sort of union womanhood and that question of marriage and who your partner is and whether you're married, not just partner, whether you have a husband or not, is so critical in shaping what womanhood means, and becomes this point of contestation into the late 19th and 20th century in ways that made me wonder if actually, and womanhood cross race, made me wonder if in fact this particular emergence of union womanhood and this grappling with union womanhood, it actually has ripple effects that are even further beyond the this 19th century, this mid-19th century moment, or the Civil War moment, or the postbellum moment. That it just seems like there's something here about, there's something to be said about the impact that Black women emerging out of slavery and Black women emerging into and through the Civil War have on all conceptions of womanhood, and structurally how that happens. So I'm thinking of, for instance, Black women who, the early generations of Black women historians who couldn't, had to like leave their jobs as teachers or as social workers if they got married. And the antecedents of this are generally put in white womanhood and the kind of roles of gender, but it seems like maybe you're telling a different origin point. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on that, or if that's what I'm sensing from some of the story that you're telling here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely something that I'm continuing to think about. I think I'm thinking about it in terms of social, the relationship between social and legal history. And I'm saying that because marriage, and this is coming from folks like Nancy Cott, it's coming from Laura Edwards, it's coming from Stephanie McCurry, who really sort of emphasize how central not only marriage, but heterosexual marriage is into organizing women's rights within the state. But I think what you've picked up on is that I'm not just saying that women are laying claims to union widowhood, but they are also developing conceptions about union widowhood, and they are advancing that conception in a governmental institution and also legal systems. And that's why it's really important. And it's important to think about that as we're talking about various movements that are being advanced by middle-class Black women in this moment. But I think the other way that I'm thinking about this as of late has really been informed by Saidiya Hartman, who informs everything, and she's great. right? I mean, but what occurred to me, and also my colleague Sharon Romeo, who I think would sort of situate herself in social and legal history, that this is a moment, to borrow from C.D. Hartman, of social upheaval. This is a moment where yes, African Americans are thinking about reunification. Yes, they're thinking about the politics of marriage, but they are also reconceptualizing, I would argue, their roles within the household. And I think that's particularly the case with soldiers' wives who show up in this book, because they are responsible for, in addition to earning wages and housework, how it's kind of traditionally framed in the historiography, they are also doing a tremendous amount of care labor for their children, but also medical kind of care labor for their husbands. And in some cases, I have women who are like, I'm out of here. They go, they say, I'm gonna earn wages in the North and send money home. I'm not doing this. So I do think this is a moment where, and the community scrutinizes those women, and the community can create obstacles for women getting pensions as well. But I do think this is a moment where free women are thinking about rethinking what marriage means. They're rethinking what their roles within the household means. They're thinking about whether they want to be married. They're thinking about, do they want intimate partnerships outside of the context of marriage? And we have a large historiography that addresses that. But I also think you're getting at some other points that I'm certainly writing down because I think they're interesting. And I hope we can continue that conversation, that are sort of interesting. And I'm thrilled that the work is inspiring those thoughts about constructions of womanhood during this period. But I do really think that working for women, obviously Tara Hunter's brilliant work, and To Joy My Freedom sort of sets the tone and inspiring me for a lot of this. But I still think there's just so much work that has to be done on freed women and that moment of, again, social upheaval coming out of the Civil War and into the Reconstruction period of what's happening, that we need more analysis there to understand what's happening. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandi. And let's see if we have more questions coming from the other participants who didn't ask questions yet or who want to ask new questions. I would like to ask, let's see if we have anybody else, but I would like to ask to Brandi one. Then I have several questions, and of course this is not my field, but I ask myself in terms of what do we learn about the history of slavery, the past of slavery through these claims, because then there are two elements here that I think about. Then, of course, in more or less in this period at the end of the 19th century, when there were these demands, this movement for pensions as reparations for slavery in the United States, then there is a lot of this sort of narratives that we see of formerly enslaved people who were then either sending letters or then into different kinds of correspondences or the documents of that movement. And through those narratives, we're able to see then their views on the past as enslaved people. Of course, that here not all the cases that you are looking at are people who were formerly enslaved, but I'd like to know what can we learn about this past through these claims, and what do we learn in terms of what these individuals would have in terms of demands of reparations in these claims? Do these demands of these claims of pensions, do they carry any elements that we could have that could give us an idea about how these women they could envision what reparations could be. One of the elements that I found interesting in the book is that section, now I just don't see the number of the chapter, on the first purchases that these women will make once they get these pensions. And then you refer to especially clothing and things that were very personal. But I ask myself also in terms of other then elements which were important in terms of these demands of reparations, for example, the issue of land, then things that are bigger than the more little things that are the clothing and so on. Then perhaps this is not necessarily, of course, the focus, but I ask myself in terms of the sources that you consulted, and especially all these claims that you read, if there are any elements that emerge from the sources.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have your finger on the pulse. I mean, I think that part of what I'm saying is that these women understand that they're in a very particular system. And I think this connects with the question about fraud that was earlier, and connects with what I said, or hope to articulate when I was talking today, that women really come to see the Pension Bureau as an arena to sort of advance their claims for redress. And I think that's also what's going on with Charlotte Banks, that this is an entitlement benefit, but this is also redressing the past and the sacrifices made during the war. I think on the local level, and again, why local analysis was really helpful for me in sort of reconstructing this community, is that in fact, there are offices of the ex-slave pension network or movement in New Bern. I'm forgetting the woman's last name, but her first name is Julia. And I actually refer to it in the book, and I think it's indexed as well. So I think there's absolutely a conversation that is inspired by what these women are advancing in the Pension Bureau, and their articulations of justice that oftentimes fall outside of the purview of what the Pension Bureau is willing to address through the pension system and marriage. In fact, many times their claims are not addressed because the demands they're making are much bigger than than only being a marital spouse. And so I would also say, I think it is important as we talk about and think about legacies of slavery and redress, to look very closely at this story, because, and I think it's in the conclusion where I'm talking about this might be a starting point to begin to, even when people start talking about reparations, that conversations oftentimes happens outside of gender and family. And I think this gives us a framework to think about family as well, and how women are grappling with this question and trying to push issues of redress in a system that isn't really set up to hear those kinds of claims. But nonetheless, I think it gives us a framework to think about how not only they made the claims, but how they sustain the claims over a long span of time, and as states' rights are collapsing across the South. So yes, I see this work very much a part of this broader conversation about reparations and redress. And I think ultimately that's at the heart of some of the claims that are constantly being denied, but why women keep pushing forward, because they see this as an issue of reparations as well. Yeah.
I think that there are some of the elements that you bring. Of course, pensions is one element. The other element is the importance of women, that they were crucial in that during the entire movement for reparations, but especially at that point, already at the 18th century individually, and then as leaders of that pension movement. And there is another element also that you bring out the fraud. This is another element, because this has been always the point of these authorities, federal authorities, to find elements of fraud in order to deny these rights. Then it's really fascinating. And I would have another question, and I see that there is someone who is raising her hand. But my other question, it would be more of a comment regarding the fact that you have all these characters in the book that you follow. And I would just call the attention for those who didn't read the book, that it's very interesting the way that Brandi, she puts in the beginning already of the book a list of these characters. And this, I would say, this sort of care with the narrative that is about people, then is not only about I would say, even if she examined different, many claims, but it's not demographic, it's not economics, it's about these women, and we know their names, and they are followed as characters. Then let's see, Damita Green, do you want to go on video?
Hi, I'm fine with just staying on audio. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Dr. Brimmer, I'm Damita Drayton Green, first year PhD student at Morgan State University, great fan of your work, and am very honored to have the ability to speak with you and hear of your work here in your book. My question pertains to your aspect of addressing widowhood in your book from the perspective of those who were married. I believe there are some cases where mothers filed for pensions because they were dependents on their son's income and such. Did you find any differences other than, of course, age in that, but the way that mothers were treated in their cases versus wives in filing for pensions? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So so a couple things happen, and this actually blends well with the last comment about characters, because again, I really did try to tell the story from the perspective of women and women's networks and communities and relationships between I guess what would be daughter-in-laws and mothers. And so sometimes there are great battles between mothers of sons who perished in the war and the wives or widows at that point. And that kind of tension comes up in a couple of claims I'm thinking about in particular, but one, the case of Laura Gardner. She actually marries a soldier in South Carolina and then returns with him to New Bern to live with her spouse who's living at the time, William, and his mother. And after William dies, there's great tension between the mother and the daughter-in-law. With regard to the pension system and how it treats mothers, the pension system is also interested in marriage in so much mothers who file petitions have to show that they are in great poverty, that their husbands, if they are living, are not able to financially support them. And if they can establish that, so they can be married, but if their husband, let's say that he's is unhealthy and is in a situation where he can't work and support the family, then mothers can advance a claim. Mothers are also, so there's an interesting case with a woman by the name of Ida Coleman, and another woman, I can't remember off the top of my head, but what I find interesting, because they're in this community of so many widows, they take great pains in their applications to talk about how they're not married, how they don't have intimate partnerships with men. And I think that's in part because they're in this community of widows and they've witnessed so many soldiers' widows been policed and kicked off the pension rolls because of how their intimate lives are surveilled. But the short answer is yes. Mothers could file claims. I have a number of examples in the book and sort of how that plays out with daughter-in-laws, but also in terms of mothers within communities and how they advocated for the legitimacy of themselves and their son's service. Yeah.
Okay, then we don't have more questions, and we are arriving really at the end of the time that we have allotted for this discussion. Then I would like to thank then Brandi for this great book and this great presentation as well. Then once again, for those of you who are around or who will show up on YouTube seeing this video later, do not forget, this is the book Claiming Union, Widowhood, and this is by Brandi Brimmer, published by Duke University Press in 2020. And you continue meeting again in the next several weeks. Then go to www.slaveryarchive.wordpress.com, and you are going to have all the sessions are listed there, and you have the links to the register for the sessions. Next week, now in 2 weeks from now, we are going to discuss my own book, this very short book by Routledge, Museums and Atlantic Slavery. And then in 3 weeks from now, we are also going to discuss Kate Masur, Until Justice Be Done, which is a topic that is very related to the book that Brandi just published. Then you are going to have several of these different areas and periods and regions, then other books on focusing more on Africa, some focusing on Latin America, including Cuba. And I hope that you come back to attend. And once again, I would like to thank Brandi for being here. And also, let me just add the spotlights here, Alex, and also then Vanessa, and hopefully, and Jessica Johnson, then she is there with us, but I am not spotting lighting her because she's just on audio. Then thank you so much. And once again, then I would invite you to congratulate Brandi for her great book and encourage you to read the book and to assign the book to your students as well. Thank you so much, Brandi. Thank you all who attend. Thank you, and hope to see you back again.